I promised a full review of Isaac Unknown, the Albatross Tales, and gosh darn it, it's late, but it's here. Special shout out to the guest editor we have for this video who volunteered to help. Greatly appreciate that, Louis Aldanis. Isaac Unknown, the Albatross Tales. This is my second full review on one of my first best chapters, whatever. I liked the first chapter a lot. It was folksy, it had some interesting world building, and I didn't really know what to expect. And I think my only big criticism was, tonally, it's a little flippant with the main character, humor, but I was interested to see where it goes. Sometimes when I'm reading these stories, I have like bits in my head. Oh, here's how I'm going to introduce this. Hey, here's how I'm going to talk about this part. And I take notes as I read. That's a new thing. I figured I should be more professional. But really, the first, we'll call it the first section here, the first bit where he arrives at this bar, which is the first chapter setting up, which goes on like 5 or 6 chapters. I was going to do a bait and switch where I pretend I hate it. I'm like, normally I rate web novels 5 out of 10, but I can't do that here. I have to rate this out of 10 like a professional work. I'm not going to do that. Obviously, I'm talking about the bit instead of doing the bit. But this start is so phenomenal. Essentially, we have the setup where Isaac, he's got his zombie dog. He's driven to a bar. He's sitting down and waiting, and he's meeting a demon for a transaction. Okay? And right as the demon enters, it's so well written. There's this monologue. The demon sits down. He has this monologue. And monologues are really just room for the writer to really flex their muscles. And really for web novels, which are, a little below average compared to normal professional stuff, I've never really read any monologues in a web novel I liked. And this one was pretty good. This was a fairly entertaining monologue. I was like, okay, I'm impressed so far with the prose. This is an interesting character. And then the next chapter, I think it was, there was another monologue, and it turned out as like a character bit for this character, but it was another really good one. I smiled, okay? Sometimes you're just sitting there reading a book, watching television or movies, and you're just passive. You're just, okay, enjoy it. Then something happens, and you smile, and I don't do that a lot. I actively enjoyed this right away. And that's like this stuff back here. There's plenty of books that I even like that I didn't smile. And one of them we're going to talk about is Dresden Files, which I read the first book finally. That was fairly recent for me. It feels like a big influence here. You have a sort of magical realism world where your main character, he's not a wizard, he's a magician. He's basically a Dresden magician. And, there's just magical stuff in the world that people don't pay attention to. That's the gist. And it felt very Dresden in its conception, which if you don't know, Dresden is almost like a CSI crime. I've only read the first one once again, but the first one at least, it's sort of like a CSI story of the week, except instead of like the police, you have a wizard who's doing a private detective thing, and there's that supernatural paint on top of it. And it's very folksy. It's very kind of like that hard-boiled noir. Forget which is which. One is movies, one is books. And that's sort of the tone we're going for here, where there's a lot of pulp to the way it's written and the dialogue, and it reminded me of Dresden, except why talk about this and me smiling? At no point when I read the first Dresden book did I ever crack a smile and like have that inward thing of like saying, I'm enjoying myself. Darn it, I enjoyed myself starting off with this book, with this web novel. So big kudos right away. I'm just going to do the opening bit. We have a magic guy, Isaac Unknown. The Unknown is a moniker given to him because he says he doesn't know his last name. Might be true, might not. I expect it is a lie because names have power, as we established, and that's very Dresden as well, and some of the world building. Isaac has brought his zombie dogs because he needs protection. So clearly this is going to be a bit of a dangerous deal with this demon. And the demon, he's a bit of a menacing figure. He's very pulpy, very likes to talk, and it's really good dialogue. I liked his character. And of course, it sort of ends up being that way over the course of, how many chapters is it?
5 minutes later.
5. It's the first 5 chapters. And And we see Isaac, I mean, you can't really say it resolves in a super clever way. It sort of resolves in the way, you know, bringing zombie dogs to a deal does. But it's all horribly entertaining. There's some great prose, and there's an astounding amount of character voice where I'm looking at this and I'm thinking like, an agent needs to read this. This is really darn good. And that's the start of the book. That's just how we'll lay our groundwork here. The start, I would recommend everyone just go read those first 5 chapters because it's really enjoyable. And it's a great way to start your book. If I'm going to critique those first 5 before we get into the overall plot of the story and my bigger comments, which I'm going to go ahead and preface this right now, not as positive. Once again, referencing the bit and whatnot. I come down from that high, and I'm willing to call this web novel quality. But what was I saying? Critiques on that first bit. Some of the character voices bleed a little bit. The demon Malik, he's like a very demony name. Like no one's named Malik or Malik, whatever these people are named. Malik, I think it is. Actually, I have it written down. It is Malik. Malik has a line when he's first introduced, and it really bleeds into the main character's line, sort of voice, where it's like that kind of like snarky, witty, like really no substance to it. That was my critique in the first chapter, where it didn't feel necessarily like that Malik was saying the line. It felt like a line Isaac would have, and that'll be a theme running through it a bit. This might just be how the author talks in these sort of snarky witticisms. Like he has a sense of what's the word? Not comedy, humor. He has a sense of humor, and this is how he does humor, regardless of which character it is. And I get to some degree, but you do need to have those characters not bleed over. And the second critique here in that first 5 is that there's a weird bit with the POV. Like it doesn't bleed together. You see a lot of web novels, especially lesser authors, will sort of just randomly swap POVs or do stuff confusingly. This makes sense when it's done. You see POV swap where the scene is from Malik's perspective as he sort of causes chaos in this bar and screws with the bikers. But it's very strange to see it from his perspective. Like Malik's not like a super major character in this story as a whole. So we're losing out really the intro to our book. We're not seeing and building up like Isaac's perspective and what he knows. And there's really no reason why we're getting Malik's perspective at the end of the day. I guess because he's the actor. He's the one going forth and influencing the situation. So we I don't know, like a first person kind of deal. Like the action's about him, make sure the chapter's about him. But I don't think the POV adds anything. It would be more interesting and use that space to build up our main character. And the only real thing I can think of why it was done is so you have that end sort of surprise because Isaac sort of slips out the bar. It's not even a surprise because we've seen the necro dogs, the dead dogs. And so, yes, we know this is what's going to happen, okay? So it's a weird choice. But otherwise, like even with these weird choices, it's really darn good. Like, if I was just to rate the first 5 chapters on like my professional scale out of 10, like it's like a 7 or an 8. I was really into it. There was obvious like little weird bits here with like some of the grammar and whatnot, like just stuff like that would be knocked out immediately by a line editor. But no, I loved it. I really loved it. And now we get to the rest of the book. And the entire purpose, he gets the deal, he wins, and he gets these black tarot cards, which we'll get into that. But then it shifts gears. We go from Dresden, and we enter the realm of Buffy the Vampire Slayer, where he goes back to his secret base, and he has a Giles. He has a Giles from Buffy the Vampire Slayer, which Dresden also had Bob. But this guy feels more, I mean, I guess structurally they're the same kind of character. Yeah, it felt more like, personality-wise, more like a Giles. And so he turns the stuff in, and we find out he works for this thing called The Agreement. And so basically that's the rest of the book, is these serialized bit-by-bit stories that are kind of standalone. Goes out and does these jobs for The Agreement, and there's a slight overarching structure. It's interesting. I want to say first off that a web novel format is probably the best place for something like this. And obviously there's been other things. I loved Hyperion, for example, which is really just short stories with like an overarching thread. But this doesn't feel like short stories. It feels like an episode of television every few chapters where like Supernatural or once again Buffy, and I can't really compare that to Dresden. I just watched a YouTube video the other day. Apparently there was a Dresden television show and it was awful. But it feels like Monster of the Week. Okay, there's, I think what was the second one? Was it the Hillbillies? The second one was the Hillbillies. Go escort these hillbillies on a vampire hunt. Okay, and then that's just what it is, and it's done, and you say, what was the point of that? That's where it really falls in sort of quality to me, is that it's becomes, from the professional setting, this is the point where I said, okay, it's a web novel and not a professional book. Because any one of these serialized stories, not anyone, but most of the serialized stories feel really, you could just take anyone out and it wouldn't affect the story. There wasn't a huge like point to it. And it felt like, I don't know, like what you would expect for a web novel serial, even though a lot of people don't do it this way. So I think that was the issue. And once again, there's an overarching story. And if we're going to jump to the end, like things are reincorporated, like the black tarot cards that he did the demon deal for in the first one. At the end, they're there and he uses them. You're like, okay, cool. I feel like you have to almost judge this based on each individual little self-compressed story. And right away, there's an issue there because the first one we got was by far the most enjoyable. Like there's author comments and I feel like he felt like he was on a schedule. He needed to keep stuff up. So I think maybe there was a dip in quality. But also I don't know, it just wasn't as engaging. And there was if we're going to compare this to Hyperion, for example, each one of those short stories that we took part in built to a whole. You were getting a piece of the larger puzzle that the story was about. I guess this could work in theory, swapping between the overarching plot and these smaller narratives. Obviously, TV does that a lot, but you would need to have some sort of relation between the smaller stories and the larger story, or those small stories would just have to be so darn good on their own that I don't care that we're doing a diversion. Like, I watched Supernatural recently, and even like the crappy one-off episodes, which objectively I think are way less interesting than, I guess I shouldn't use objective for a purely subjective thing, but objectively we're going with it. They're way less interesting than the main plot line, but even at the end of those episodes, they'll have like a stinger, a 30-second scene where they're like, okay, here's how the main plot is getting moved forward. There's the illusion of plot, even when there is no plot. He has to be accomplishing something with each one of these jobs. Like the agreements like you have to pay off your debt to us. These jobs help you pay off your debts. Like there's a progression. You just need some loose framework that makes them feel meaningful, even by the smallest degree. I mean, it's there, and I feel like it's almost setting up the second book where you get a lot more of that. And I'd say by the epilogue and the last chapter, it definitely feels that way, where it's going to be more focused in the second book. But on its own, like, it's not the part of the story that stands out to me at all. Characters. Isaac. My complaint in the first chapter was that he was kind of, like, little snarky, a little marvelly, and that doesn't change. The main character is not a great vessel for this story. I mean, he's acceptable, and there's sort of that like devilish rogue charm to him. That's what the author is going for, at least, where he's constantly getting into trouble. He's constantly getting over his head. He makes a plan. He makes all his plans just fall on their face, to the point where you as the reader are like, why? I know when he makes a plan, it's not going to go right. Especially as a narrator, right? Like, I'm looking once again at Harry Dresden, where even that first book wasn't super interesting. Like, it's a strong voice from the narrator, and you get like substance. And I feel like that's the unknown part of the Isaac Unknown, is that it's like ethereal, his character, where it's supposed to be mysterious and you're supposed to like have doubts and not know who he is, but he's the vessel for the story. It needs to be more of his personality and more of his like opinions and history and stuff like that. And once again, if we're going to go back to what I already talked about, when the demon, you swap to the demon, and like, why? We need an anchor for all of these stories, and it needs to be Isaac, and he needs enough depth to hold this entire story together, because if you aren't going with the overarching story, it becomes a character piece, and he doesn't have the depth to hold a character piece story together. Yeah. And like, I feel like the characters become that way a little bit. Like there's the pulpy elements, there's the witty dialogue and whatnot, but like the Giles character, the Bob character, I think just call him the Norwegian. He's just kind of bland and boring. He's not in it a lot, but he's just kind of bland and boring. And like if you look at Bob from Dresden Files, Bob's like this snarky like spirit in a skull, and he's got a lot of personality, and like every line he has is dripping with personality. And you have Giles, who's like this nebbish librarian, and it's sort of cute on his own, just because he is like so over his head, it seems like, and so nebbish, but he doesn't carry those scenes. When you have the research scenes in Buffy, and when you have those scenes where like everyone comes together and tries to figure things out and come up with a plan, it's not just Buffy and Giles, it's Buffy and Giles and like the entire cast, they're all together. We need more characters if it's just this guy. And there just has to be some charm to him, especially because he's filling a role we've seen before. So like, what's his character? I found the agreement guy who's sending him out on these missions and reaping the rewards more interesting. There was a little more personality there. Although for someone like him, it's more acceptable to be more mysterious. Once you get further in, you have like your female lead, I guess we can call her that. She's fine. I find her more interesting than Isaac. Just because I feel like when you're in a character's head and when you're supposed to know these characters, it's more unforgivable when they're not as fleshed out. World building. It's very magical realism, very, very Dresden-y, sort of Buffy, all this stuff. I keep mentioning it. The world building doesn't do a great job of establishing necessarily the rules of the world or how everything fits together. When you have loose world building, you give people snippets. And those snippets, they let you imagine what the greater whole is like, but the snippets all sort of like work together. The first instance of this, I think, was the hillbilly bounty hunter story, where he gets hired to do a job to help these hillbillies hunt a vampire, right? They call them ticks, leeches. They call them ticks, I think. In any case, these hillbillies know it's a vampire. And there's some fun dialogue about them saying, is this illegal? Actually, no, that was Isaac, the waitress. Is this illegal? I don't know. Who knows if this is illegal or not? And that's cute that you have like these locals, once again, very supernatural hunter thing, where they're hunting the vampire. But then at the same time, they know it's a vampire. They know there's magic in the world, but also they don't know there's magic in the world. They see like a magical trap at the vampire's house, and they're like, we don't believe in magic. And it becomes weirder because the book directly addresses this instance that I'm thinking of, where Isaac in his head says, like, even when they see magic, they don't believe in it. But they do believe in it. They believe in vampires. They hired a magician. They went out of the way to find someone who is a magician, a magic person. And they said, you come with us to keep us safe with magic. And he showed them a magic trick, which that was kind of a lame scene. Like, as far as magic tricks go, when you imagine that scene in your head where you impress the locals. Beside the point. So it's weird. It's weird. Conceptually, I get what it's going for. But I think if I did not have the backlog in my head of other stories like this, I'm not entirely sure it would come through on its own. If this was the first story of its kind, I would not understand what the author is going for here. The prose is great. My first thought when reading it was like, this is just a hair below professional, where you get a professional editor in there and like in one pass, it'll be book quality. And I think that's more or less true for the entire book. I don't think it stays as consistently strong as it started out with, but at any point, if this was cleaned up, I would be more than happy to pick this off a shelf and read it. Is it the best written thing I've seen? No, it's not. There is actually the person who's editing this video has a better prose, but this is some darn good prose where you look at it and you say, okay, the prose is at the level. It's just everything else, if we're going to summarize Isaac, not quite at the level. The story, there's good parts, but also I get bored with it, with some of the more boring side stories and like the relation to the overall plot. The characters, there's some like, once again, it almost gets hurt because I love the start so much. And maybe this is on me. Maybe I have too high of expectations from that absolutely killer start. But it really comes down to Isaac for me. He needs a little more, like he needs 10% more. Isaac needs a 10% more of a punch up there and more of a I'm assuming the writer has read Dresden. He had to have, right? It seems so overtly inspired by Dresden, but take another pass. I've only read the first book, but take another pass on how Dresden speaks and how he's presented and how often sort of his personality and ideas come into the story. And that's what you need to do. And if I think any one of these issues were solved, I'd move it past web novel quality. Like if there was like a really cohesive story I loved, boom, professional quality. If there was a character to ground these things and sort of make these side stories more fun and more interesting, boom, professional quality. As is though, this is a web novel. And this is, as of now, this is the best web novel I've ever read. Yes. I still need to read more Worm. That's on my to-do list. I'm definitely doing that soon. But Isaac Unknown is very good. It's very good, and it's very web novel-y. So kudos to Isaac Unknown. It's got a sick cover. I'm sure it's been up here the entire time. I'm sort of scooched over and I'm ignoring the rule of thirds here. But editor, put a big thumbs up for Isaac Unknown. I'm giving this, obviously, if this is not clear, I'm giving Isaac Unknown a 5 out of 5. And I do have to acknowledge, I realize this review seems really negative, but I don't know. Most of this was just coming out so strong that I loved it, and then everything sort of disappointing me from there on out, from those first 5-6 chapters. So yeah, I don't want this to sound negative, because this is legitimately the best web novel I've read yet. Ooh, we have some notes. I have some questions to the author here. So this is the first one. As I was looking over stuff and preparing for this video, I didn't even realize it at the time. The thought occurred to me when reviewing that first scene, because I reread the first 5 chapters because I liked them a lot, and I wanted to reread it and make sure it wasn't just me like poo-pooing on the rest of the book. No, the first 5 chapters are that good. But Isaac went to this bar with human beings who, granted, some of them were kind of dicks, but, you know, there's some innocent people too. And he went there with zombie dogs because he knew the demon was going to betray him, presumptively. I mean, that's a safe assumption. It was not like bad writing. It's like, okay, we can assume this is an acceptable level of presumption here. And so the demon ends up killing everyone. The demon kills everyone, including the bartender, which I'm not sure what he did. And then, so I guess my thought is Isaac prepared for this. He knew this was going to happen. So our main character went to this bar, specifically the bar he chose, knowing he was going to get a lot of people killed. Like that goes beyond just poor planning. It seems actively negligent and malicious for our main character. And that's sort of what I'm talking about when I say, like, he doesn't quite work as a character, because and granted, once again, I didn't even realize this until I was doing a little bit of a reread for this video. But if you take that with any sort of logic, like the way you would present that is that the demon chose this bar. You impress that on the reader, that the demon chose this bar. Isaac tried to get out of it because he was worried, and there's just no other way. This deal was happening one way or the other, and Isaac, he doesn't like it. Isaac has regard for, does he really have regard for human life? Like, this is what I'm talking about with his character, where like everyone dies, and that's what Albatross means. Apparently, they mentioned it in the book, and I had to look this up. Apparently, Albatross are like symbols of death. So, like, that's the bit, but that also makes for an unsympathetic character. Like, he doesn't really feel all that bad that people die. He's not broken up about it. People die. It's like, oh, I'm cursed. I'm the Albatross. People die around me. Oh, big deal. Even though when he's expecting it, he doesn't really take steps to prevent it. Also, comedy-wise, the book's at its weakest when it's trying to be comedic. This can go in the prose section. The book is at its weakest when it's trying to be comedic. Yeah, I mean, it's not overtly annoying, but it feels like the low-hanging fruit oftentimes, where you say, that's the obvious joke. There's nothing really funny here, and it doesn't make the main character more like clever or interesting. It makes him feel more juvenile, if anything. I got look at my notes here. This could be its own video. Chapter 12, I was just sort of getting visibly frustrated here. I was like, what is the plot? That's my only note on chapter 12, because I didn't understand what it was doing yet. And when you you don't clue the readers in, I guess that's a little frustrating. I think I would have been more okay with it if it was clear that it was going to be a serialized set of stories that don't really have much interlocking components. And as we got to the end, there were a few chapters that were weird. It felt like, I don't know if this was a writing mistake or an uploading to web novel mistake, but it felt like there were chapters that would like start and there'd be like no foundation or establishment in the chapter who's speaking. So it almost felt like he wrote a longer chapter, but then go like, web novels, keep it short, keep them interesting. So he just cut it off in the middle. It's like, here's chapter 37, here's chapter 38. And you start chapter 38 and like, you're already right in it. You don't even know who's talking. There's not like someone said, they said, it's just like a continuation of a dialogue. I was like, oh, that's bizarre. It's really weird. And I feel like that's the only way it happened, right? Is that someone wrote a long chapter and just cut it up into parts and released them as separate chapters. Because I don't think I've seen that before, which is weird. It's the most web novel I've read that doesn't involve, like, even, I was about to say that doesn't involve like reincarnation or RPG systems, but even those aren't super serialized. Like, I mean, I guess they are to some degree, but there's not like this sort of disjointed nature to them. Very web novel-y. 5 out of 5. Check it out.